Hey everyone. I was glad to hear AFT was talking about Texas because that's where I hail from. So I'm from Workers Defense Project, and we're a statewide membership-based organization that's winning better working conditions for Texans. So I think our organization, compared to a labor union, is very small, but we're proving that you can even win for workers in one of the toughest political climates in the country, along with our partners, the AFT. So inevitably, when I come to events like this, I hear from folks afterwards in the audience that they feel sorry for me, that doing this kind of work in Texas must be really tough. And I'll be the first to admit that it is incredibly tough organizing in Texas, but that's also why I love it and why I think it's so much fun. Because when you're at rock bottom, you can only go up, and that's exactly what we're doing. So I could talk to you about what it means to organize in a right-to-work state, about what it means to win in a place like Texas that is the second largest economy in the country, or the fact that in our industry, which we focus on the construction industry, and is the largest single contributor to the Republican Party in Texas, by the way, also the largest employer of undocumented labor, and one of the top 10 employers in the state. That's who we're taking on. And I could talk to you about the facts and figures, but I want to talk more about the individual impact, the human stories that impact our work and what we're trying to achieve in Texas and where we go from here. So also to mention, someone mentioned earlier, there's been all these good construction jobs added. These are good middle-class jobs. I will argue that specifically in Texas and where the construction industry is growing the fastest, they are no longer good blue-collar middle-class jobs. In Texas, there are close to 1 million workers in our state in the construction industry, and the building trades will tell you themselves that they estimate that it's 1% of the workforce is unionized, 1%. So in Texas, who really faces the impact of those kinds of conditions are workers on the ground. And as I mentioned, half of the workforce is undocumented. So one of those workers that came to our organization a few years ago was Santiago Arias. And Santiago, like many workers in the construction industry, had come because he had been mistreated on the job. And he was doing demolition work, which if you know anything about demolition work is dirty, dangerous work, making $10 an hour on a commercial project in downtown Houston. His employer didn't want to pay for a harness, and so he sent him up several stories, and Santiago fell. And they rushed him to the hospital, and they were able to save his life. But today he's a quadriplegic, and he'll never walk or work again. And Santiago left the hospital with close to $1 million in medical bills. And he found out when he left the hospital that his employer also didn't carry workers' compensation coverage because Texas is only one of 2 states, Oklahoma joined us the last legislative session, one of only 2 states that don't require employers to even carry workers' compensation coverage. So Santiago sued his employer, got close to $100,000, but that went straight to his medical care costs. His wife is now his full-time caretaker, so she feeds him and bathes him. And what you have to understand is that Santiago is one of the lucky ones, actually, because no place is more deadly to work in the country than Texas for construction workers. And whatever you may hear from our former governor, Rick Perry, that things are just worse in Texas just because it's bigger, the reality is that California has twice the size of the workforce that we do and 1/3 of the number of deaths. So I lay out this story so you can understand the context that we organize in Texas, and the fact that also in our industry, 41% of workers are misclassified, 41%. So we're up against a lot, which has forced us to be creative, has forced us to think about organizing in a new way, which I actually think is a good thing, and we try and learn from the labor movement in other parts of the country, but hopefully we can offer some lessons learned as well for you all. So even in the face of those kinds of conditions is why we think about our story as really a modern day story of David and Goliath. So our members that have the deck stacked completely against them, they don't vote because most of them are undocumented. They don't speak English. They're not even classified correctly as employees. And they are standing up to this giant industry. And they've been able to pass 2 statewide laws and a supermajority Republican legislature that are better protecting the rights of thousands of workers in the state. And we've taken on some of the largest corporations in the world. I wonder how many people have heard of a small company called Apple, right? So in Texas, the way we do business is we give millions of dollars away to corporations. Well, Apple, couple of years ago, got close to $30 million in tax breaks from our local state and county government to come build one of their largest facilities in our backyard. And everyone in city government was talking about how great this was going to be to bring all these high-tech, high-paying jobs to our city. But no one was talking about the janitorial workers, the construction workers, what kind of wages and conditions they would have. In fact, the city openly admitted they had never even thought of asking that. And so we were able to get Apple to sit down and negotiate with us, higher wages for construction workers, higher safety standards, but most importantly, that we would get to be on the project from start to finish to talk to all construction workers, union and non-union, to make sure that they were receiving the conditions that the standards had set out in the agreement that we were able to get with Apple. And now we have similar standards on over $500 million worth of construction projects in Austin, and have access to those work sites, again, from start to finish of the project, access to contractors and access to workers to make sure that our conditions are met. And because the city of Austin got incredibly tired of us flooding city council chambers every time with union and non-union workers, hundreds of workers, every time one of these agreements was up, they passed one of the most progressive economic development policies in the country for construction workers. So if you're going to get any tax dollars like these in the future for the city of Austin, you have to pay construction workers a living wage or prevailing wage, whichever is higher, because for some of our trades, prevailing wage is actually close to minimum wage in Texas. You have to have higher safety standards, workers' compensation, and there are incentives for hiring disadvantaged workers from training schools, Reed Union schools in Austin. So we're very, thank you. It's very hard to win. And now being in a place like Texas has forced us to be creative. And we try to think through how do we develop smart, sound strategy that is accompanied with smart workplace organizing campaigns that protects the good union jobs in the industry while also bringing up the floor for non-unionized workers. And that was not an easy sell for our union brothers and sisters about why they should work with us in the building trades. In fact, it was a rocky road to get them to be willing to work with us and see that it was really about leveling the playing field for all workers. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And one of the challenges is bringing up revenue. So when we won these campaigns against developers and they've signed an agreement, in the past we have gotten foundation money to allow us to monitor those projects. That is not a scalable model. You just create more work for yourself when you win a campaign, and then you have to pay for the burden of monitoring those projects. So now we've started to talk to developers about paying for the monitoring, that it is a service that should be paid for, and an investment into their projects, and an investment into our local communities. So we have some developers that have agreed to start paying for this, and just learned, if I'm allowed to announce. No. Something else? Okay. Got an eye from some. So the three big questions that we're really trying to answer when we do our work is, one, how do we actually improve working conditions for thousands of workers by making sure that we're negotiating with the real power broker in our industry? In construction, where 41% of workers are misclassified, that is not individual employers. It is developers and investors. And so we need to make sure we're actually negotiating with them. And that's a big challenge, I think, for the labor movement is we can no longer just negotiate with individual employers. It is not the road to power for workers. The second one is that how do we develop strategies that create a revenue stream when we win a campaign? And that's the big question we have to answer. I know that there's been lots of pieces written, even by people in this room. Our worker center is the future of the labor movement, and I will be the first worker center to argue they are not until they figure out a revenue stream. That no worker center at this point, there are some good creative ideas, but they are not scalable, and thus they cannot take on the industries and the economic power players in our country if they don't figure that out. And then lastly, I would say that how do we craft a message and a strategy that really makes sense for the South and resonates with our political climate and resonates with workers where we are. So oftentimes when unions come to Texas, you can go out and survey how many people actually even know when you say collective bargaining, what the hell you're talking about. They don't even know what you're talking about. Most of them don't really have any familiarity with a union. And while there have been tremendous gains on raising the minimum wage or winning paid sick days in other parts of the country, many of those propositions are illegal in many parts of the South. So we have to develop strategies that make sense for the South and not just expect that the South working conditions for workers are going to rise because we have really progressive strategies in the East and West Coast. And so that are the big three questions that we ask ourselves is about revenue, making sure that we're negotiating with the right people, the right power players, and lastly, that we have a strategy that makes sense for our current political climate.
Great, thank you. Okay, Paul.